Now, Coleman, you've got a book coming out on this subject, The End of Race Politics, Arguments for Colorblind America. I don't know how much you want to talk about the book and what the publicity plan is, but I'm moved to ask you, what could you have possibly said in your talk that would have had people calling you a racist, declaring your talk to be dangerous, and pressuring their organization to suppress it?
Well, I said a few things. One thing I said that I think upset people is colorblindness should not be a dirty word. People associate colorblindness with conservatives, even white supremacy. You'll often hear colorblindness as a Trojan horse for white supremacy, or that it's reactionary. One thing I said in my talk is that colorblindness was at the core of the anti-slavery movement, the core of the civil rights movement, and was later abandoned. The fact that it's now later been abandoned doesn't mean that it wasn't a part of the philosophy of the civil rights movement, and that we should reinvestigate the wisdom of it as a principle. The idea of colorblindness is that no one ever gets penalized for their racial identity, and there's a logic to that for governing a racially diverse society in the long run. And wherever we want to use social policy to correct for disparities of luck and social advantage, we should prefer to use class and socioeconomics rather than race at this point. That was really the thrust of my argument that I think upset people.
Well, it'll be a cliche if I say it, but I'll say it anyway. How ironic that the moral position we should be colorblind, which one associates not only with abolition, but all the way into the 20th century with the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and all of that, would be taken as an emblem of white supremacy. I mean,
they don't realize that they're different and how modern they are, these people, in feeling injured at the possibility of their identity not being founded on a melodramatic sense of victimhood. You can see with these people, they're mad. It's like you stepped on their toe or something. You're really irritating them with the idea that this racism that's everywhere, but so difficult to identify that you need a sociologist to do it, that is not the foundation of their identity as people. Whereas 50 years ago and before, the idea often was, yes, you want colorblindness, and you don't want that to be the foundation of your identity. That's why you want the colorblindness, and you know that the world isn't perfect. But Lord forbid that your whole life would be about being a victim. Nobody would want to do that because, one day you're not alive anymore and you've let them win if that's what you found your identity upon, especially today when that identity is so fragile and performative and requires so much exaggeration. But these people are mad. Coleman, you are going to get a lot of negative feedback on the basis of this, which I know you can take, but you're going to also get just as much that's positive. But any of the positive feedback, the people we're talking about are going to see as white people enjoying being told that they're not racist. And, that's right. Just a static that can't be avoided.
And, interestingly, I was attentive to who came up to me in the halls and during the meals at TED and gave me positive feedback. And it was not all white people.
No,
there were lots of Black people.
People are relieved.
Lots of people of color that came up to me and said, "I loved your talk," and that was gratifying to see. One other thing I want to say, I was quite careful in my talk, and I think I'm careful in the book to not endorse the most naive version of colorblindness, because people do say things like, "I don't see color," which is a very confusing phrase. I think it can be meant well, but it's not true. Everyone is capable of being racially biased. And so I don't mean to deny that anywhere. Really, to me...
Or racially aware. I mean, it doesn't have to be biased.
Right.
It's simply a cognizance of...
Yeah, so people often strawman colorblindness. In my view, it's a strawman by saying, that just means you're pretending race doesn't exist or you're pretending racism doesn't exist. No, I think race is a social reality, but we should try our very best to treat people without regard to race in most cases. And that's really losing sight of that even as a goal. That's what's happened on the left. Like 20 years ago, 40 years ago, you would get a lot of people that would say, well, of course, colorblindness is the end goal, but we're not ready for that yet. You've actually heard that less and less, I think. You don't even get that concession now in most places on the left.
A couple of things occurred to me. You want to say something, Jeff?
Very quickly. What are you going to do when you've got the book out and you're talking to audiences, you're going to schools, etc.? You realize that you have a remarkable monotony coming up. You're going to have one white person after another coming up to you and saying, you know what? I don't get it. I was always raised to treat all people equally. And then they're going to look at you like, what do you have to say to that? They're going to keep saying that, and they're going to keep saying it. And frankly, that's not interesting. You understand this. You know. What are you going to say to that person? I'm just trying to put myself in your place, because that's what a lot of people are going to get from it. I was always raised not to think about race. Well, here we are. That's what people are going to keep saying. You know?
Right. You know, I would assume that if they actually read my book, that it's not that you should never think about race broadly or that you should never question yourself. I think my publisher asked me this at one point. They said, is what you're trying to do kind of give people a guilt-free way of thinking about race? And I thought to myself, well, I don't know if guilt-free is really what I'm going for, or certainly not reflection-free. I do think that you should think about, I think in general in life, you should think about your privileges. You should think critically about them. Have you benefited from the fact of your race? Have you benefited from the fact of your gender? Have you benefited from the fact of your socioeconomic standing? These are all questions that you should engage critically with as a person in the world. But you know, if the honest answer to that question is, you know, I'm say you're a white guy, you know, born in a single parent home with a drug addicted parent, if the honest answer to that question is actually no, I don't think I've benefited particularly from my race, then you should stand by that, right? When people say you should reflect on your race, often what they mean is you should automatically feel guilty because you're a white person, white. Right? Regardless of what your individual story is. I think you should reflect on your individual story and try to be very honest with yourself and with the world, but you should not automatically go into this pat formula of white equals privilege, white equals bad, black equals victim. Like, can I be honest about the fact that it's much better to apply to college as a black person? For me, that's part of my being honest about the influence of race in my life, is not to accept the simple narrative that I'm supposed to imbibe, but rather to be honest about the full spectrum of effects that race has had in my life and race has in others. And to me, my argument is compatible with that kind of a conversation, given that we all are able to enter this conversation as equals. We're all able to participate in it, and you can be at the table as a non-person of color, and you're not going to get shut out because, you know, one thing I hate people say is, one thing actually people do say frequently, and people said at TED reacting to me, besides your comment, John, which I get a lot, is, well, look, I'm just a random white guy, so I don't know. I really shouldn't say anything about the topic, but
they've learned their lesson. Right?
They've learned that anything that they say is the wrong thing to say, and that almost bothers me more.
Yeah.
You know, I'm struck by the use of the word "should" in your recounting of the experience and in your brief summary of your argument. Should. It's a moral philosophic position, should. And I'm contrasting that with the meta-analysis that you mentioned briefly, claiming that colorblindness has certain consequences or doesn't have them in terms of advancing goals that one might think are socially desirable. Can you address yourself to this distinction between the moral argument and the causal consequences argument, and tell us how you think about that?
Well, yeah, as I think you guys know, I was a philosophy major, and I was always attracted broadly to the idea of consequentialism, which is that the shoulds in life stem from what the consequences of actions or even rules are. So broadly, I do think certainly in America, I think the consequences of colorblind policy in the long run will be better than the consequences of race-based policies and race thinking in general, an obsession with race thinking in general in the long run. And that's my impetus to write the book.
I'm going to push back.
Okay.
Voting rights. We're drawing congressional districts in Alabama or South Carolina. The question is whether or not Black people are going to have an opportunity to elect a representative of their choice. Is that a completely incoherent or morally dubious conversation for you? And by that, I mean, I don't see how I can get off the ground in that conversation without A, classifying people based upon their racial identity, B, imputing to some degree a sense of representativeness when the race of the elected official matches the race of the person casting the ballot, and C, implementing on the ground enforcement mechanisms to ensure that, in fact, those people whom I've decided to see as Blacks get to elect a representative of their choice. So how do you square the historical imperative of, in the case at hand, empowering African-American voters, given our history, with your position on colorblindness?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because I think that in the case of voting rights and district drawing in general, what you get is one side trying to strategically separate heavily Black districts and disperse them among many districts, and then the other side saying, "I see what you're doing there," and you're trying to strategically dilute the power of a voting bloc that is recognizable, and trying to prevent them from doing that by drawing the lines more closely around the voting bloc. In some way, both sides are playing. They're playing on the concept of race. Both sides require the concept of race to achieve political ends there. And so it seems to me valid for Democrats in this case to say, look, I can see you trying to dilute the power of Black voters in Alabama, not because they're Black, but because they're the most reliable Democrat voting bloc. And that's anti-democratic gerrymandering, and we have to be able to push back against that. I don't think that I guess that one case doesn't necessarily extend to the other kinds of race-based policies I'm talking about in the book. For instance, race-based affirmative action, race-based emergency aid during COVID, deciding which restaurant should get aid based on the racial identity of the owner as opposed to the socioeconomic need of the restaurant. You bring up a good example, but I don't think it extends to I don't think the lesson can be drawn from it that race-based policy in general is wise or good.
Yeah. Okay. What about the distinction between color blindness in law and policy and government action on the one hand, and color blindness in terms of personal affiliation, choice of intimate partner, identity in terms of how I narrate the history of quote unquote my people, and all of that? Do you find that to be a at all useful distinction?
Absolutely, it's a useful distinction. I think that, if you are a person that says, look, I agree with you that there should be no race as a category really on which to base social policy. But in my own life, I'm Black, or I'm Korean, or I'm Jewish, and I, to be perfectly honest, prefer to be with my own. I'm going to marry someone that is of my culture. Most of my friends are of my culture. I have nothing against other cultures, but it's where I feel comfortable, and it gives me an identity, it gives me a story. And this is the story of my people, and it has meaning for me. I think that there's not much I can say to such a person, because they agree that it should be kept out of the public sphere in a way. It should be kept out of public policy and should be kind of a private thing. If I go to a deli in Harlem, and it's everyone working at the deli is Yemeni, they're not hiring colorblind, right? Do I have a problem with the Yemeni deli owner that only wants to associate with other Yemenis? No, not really. I think that to be consistent, I feel I may want to, personally, I live a pretty cosmopolitan life, and I would defend the cosmopolitan life in the sense of I have friends of every race, and I like that. I like that I'm open to having friends of every race, and associating from a place of Coleman as an individual, as opposed to Coleman, a raced person.
I don't think that's the human default, though, Coleman.
I don't think it is the human. That's right. I don't think I don't think it's the human default, and I don't judge as immoral the people that have a strong attachment. What I would want them to do is observe the distinction that you just made, that it's fine for you to have that in your own life, but let's draw a bright line between your personal private decisions and private values and what should be included in public policy.
But suppose they're white, is the question. Suppose a white person says, well, I like my people.
Look, to be consistent, if they're living their own life, if they're living their own life and not insisting that there be pro-white public policies, how are they hurting me?
Well, I think I can hear Black Ed Ted calling right now to answer that question.
Well, because suppose you need a job. Like, suppose it's like a white chain store. Suppose it's Target. I mean, I think we've gotten to the point that Target would never have such a public policy. But suppose this denies you opportunities for employment. It's a relatively thinly settled small town area. And the whites
Let me just mention, John, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I'm pretty sure, has a minimum number of employees where it doesn't apply below 15 or something like that.
Is that true?
So if I'm opening up my Yemeni bakery or my mom and pop bodega, it doesn't apply to me, and I can be preferential in my hiring policy.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know that either. But that makes, I wonder if that distinction makes sense because it's the reality, or there's some deeper wisdom to it. If you have a big chain store, to have them rejecting every Black applicant, to have Walmart rejecting every Black applicant, it wouldn't make sense, because for so many different reasons. But it just doesn't bother you to see a mom and pop shop where everyone is even in the same family, much less the same race.
Is there really a Yemeni deli in Harlem?
Oh, many.
I didn't know that.
In fact, when I was at Columbia, I would make a point of microaggressing every deli owner by asking where they're really from. And the Yemenis don't mind. But almost every 1-201 was from Yemen specifically. And I thought that was interesting because it's a country I knew nothing about, a rather small country, and yet they own and operate a huge number of delis in Harlem.
I didn't know that had become a thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, ethnic enterprise, one thinks of the Vietnamese nail salons or the Korean greengrocers or whatever. And there's a whole backstory about social capital and how people pull together and finance and mutually support each other within their identity-based social networks, which are economically valuable. And,
And by the way, this is, you know, when I was heavily reading Thomas Sowell in college. And so I felt I was coming across a obvious real life example of just a sub industry and in part of a city that was just dominated by one ethnic group. And that became interesting to me. So I always made a point of asking.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't Arab in general. It was always Yemeni.